A few weeks ago, I uploaded a video where I mentioned the many people who had, at one time, considered themselves to be Chris Chan's friends, who Chris ended up harming in some way. The only people Chris is friends with who he hasn't hurt are relatively new to his life, and, in my opinion, time will prove this statement correct. Chris always hurts the people who try to help him. My name is Gibby for Lore Cattle Ranch, and this is the Chris Chan friend Betrayal Iceberg. If you've never seen an Iceberg video before, I don't believe you. I've broken down a list of Chris's friends, and we're going to start with the most well-known stories at the top, with less well-known or more disturbing entries as we go down. We're going to start at level 1, the tip of the iceberg. Megan. The story of Megan has been gone over so much that for many people, it's basically all they know about Chris Chan beyond Sonichu. In his 20s, Chris befriended a girl around his age who he bonded with over Yu-Gi-Oh! And other anime. He attempted to be romantic with her, and she continually rejected his advances. He spammed her with emails and wrote her into Sonichu against her wishes. While she was nice to him, and likely the closest thing to a genuine friend that he had after high school, their relationship ended prematurely after Chris drew an image of them engaging in sexual activities. Then he posted it on the internet to prove that he was straight and had heterosexual fantasies. Megan basically told him to screw off, and Chris said the infamous phrase, "I do not regret drawing the drawing, because if I hadn't released my frustrations in the creative sense, I might actually have done something really dumb and stupid." Chris would continue to bring Megan up for the next decade, proclaiming her to be a goddess in his new metaphysical delusions. Filmmaker Joseph Draft included her in his documentary Chris Chan vs. the Internet, which is now lost to media. He interviewed Megan in person in 2019 and had contemporary footage of her in the film, until he cancelled it after receiving negative attention from the internet. According to Gino Samuel, who Joseph wanted to include in the project, Megan wanted to reunite with Chris in the documentary, but Joseph went against the idea because it was going to be too corny and forced. Megan later requested she be removed from the documentary altogether, and Joseph destroyed the only known copy of it to exist. Even over a decade later, Megan was still being negatively impacted by her previous friendship with Chris. Null. Null is the owner and operator of the Kiwi Farms website, which started life as the Quickie Forums, a place solely dedicated to cataloging Chris Chan, before expanding out into other topics. Chris's relationship with the site has fluctuated over the years, from being an active member to hating it and all that it stands for. Null, who many would say owes his internet notoriety to Chris Chan, spent a lot of time and money helping Chris in the late 2010s, particularly after the Idea Guy saga. A lull in attention being paid to Chris had allowed the Idea Guys to corrupt him and scam money out of him, so Null and other Kiwi Farms users drove them out of power and put safeguards around Chris to prevent anything like that from ever happening again. Chris allowed Null access to his email account and other personal information that Null would use to protect him. Null was the first known person Chris confided his relationship with his mother to, although at the time, Chris hid the fact that the woman he was seeing was his mother, only leaving in hints like she had a son around Chris's age. When the audio of Chris admitting to the incestuous relationship was leaked, Null defended Chris, stating a theory that Chris was merely being an idiot. He had a relationship with a real adult woman, but was lying to say it was Barb to conceal the woman's real identity, because Chris for some reason would think that that was better. Once it became clear that this was not the case, and most of Chris's friends and allies turned against him, Null kept up his role as Chris's protector, making sure he was okay and had somewhere to sleep. Chris had been given a no-contact order, and was not allowed home or to contact Barb in any way, and Null was working to keep Chris safe. Up until Chris stole money from Barb's bank account to pay for lodging and food. This was an arguably illegal violation of his no-contact order, and was the final nail in the coffin for Null justifying his protection of Chris. Null turned this evidence over to the police and washed his hands of the situation. When Chris was arrested and put in jail, he started referring to Null as Judas, painting him as a betrayer figure, which he maintains to this day. Anna. Anna was a retail worker at Chris's mall who wrote about an experience with him in her blog back in 2005. She titled it, "The Tale of the Crazy Pacer," and detailed an account of Chris pacing back and forth in front of the PacSun store she worked in. The girls working in the store thought he was funny and waved at him as he walked by. He eventually came inside and walked up to Anna and asked if she was 19, which she was. He introduced himself as Christian W. Chandler and asked the infamous question, "Do angels have names?" which was supposed to be a pickup line. "Do angels like you have names?" Anna quickly shot him down, and Chris told her about Sonichu and gave her a business card. This story is one of the most important events in Chris Chan chronicling because Chris wouldn't become internet famous until 2007. When trolls began looking into him, there was initially a thought that he was some sort of performance art piece or a troll himself. But this blog from 2 years prior gave a spot-on description of him, used his full name, and mentioned Sonichu. This was enough evidence that he was the real deal. Over the years, Anna would befriend and defend Chris on social media, after finding out that her blog had attracted unwanted attention to him. The worst thing that happened to Anna was that her friendship with Chris got her on the sightline of trolls, and made her a significant part of Christory. This otherwise completely normal, nearly 40-year-old person has her social media posts and pictures of her from her early 20s brought up every time a random YouTuber wants to make a video about Chris Chan. The Quickie page about her also paints her in a very poor light, including the line, "She only associates with Chris in order to feel better about her own insecurities. That way, she can say at least someone is worse off than she is." Due to her being an early part of the Chris Chan story, her relevance is often overblown. It's also hard to categorize her as a friend of Chris Chan, given that Chris Chan, as the internet cryptid that he is, didn't exist until after she encountered him. While she did continue to defend Chris long after the trolling saga began, she can hardly be lumped into the same category as the other people on this layer of the iceberg, Sarah and Steve. Sarah and Steve were a couple who had learned about Chris and wanted to protect him. They bought a Nintendo Switch for Chris and sent a letter along with it. Chris opened the Switch on video and pointed his camera directly at the letter, which opened with the line, "Do not read what's below on video or mention it online." Despite this, Chris kept it in the video and published it on YouTube. The letter read in full, "Us moving to Virginia will be a life-changing event, and you will become our only friend around. This letter was gonna be about our plans to move and help you, but we already talked on the phone about those matters. Remember, if you are ever in trouble and need help before we're able to move, just message us first. I'm afraid other people could not be very trusted. From Steven and Sarah." In July 2019, Sarah and Steve's Twitter account stated that since one of them lost their job, they were unable to do fun things with Chris, which made him upset with them. Basically, Chris liked speaking to them as long as they were buying him video games, and lost interest when their funds dried up. In July, they sent out a tweet asking Chris if he would stop being their friend if they, hypothetically, challenged his beliefs about the dimensional merge, and he immediately unfollowed them on Twitter. They later changed their Twitter bio to, "Just a couple of idiots who assumed they could help Christine, swindled out of hundreds of dollars, and were treated as subhuman. Should have listened to warnings given." The Watchmen, MKR and Not. The Watchmen were, at one time, one of the most successful groups of defenders Chris ever had, being in power for almost 3 years, although their legacy has been one of abject failure. They started as a group who wanted to control Chris into giving up his belief in the dimensional merge, and protect him from groups like the Idea Guys and Jacob Sockness along the way. However, they've been criticized for gatekeeping Chris and keeping him away from less harmful and neutral third parties, and attempting to bribe or threaten Christorians. The main members of the Watchmen I'm going to talk about are Not and MKR, who spent years speaking to Chris, hosting game nights and movie nights with him, and being his friend. My first interaction with MKR was in the comment section of one of my videos, in which she accused me of bad-mouthing her friend, that friend being Chris. After I contacted the Watchmen, we had a long conversation about their group's intentions, and one of them referred to their group as the Chris Chan Illuminati. I think that's the best way to characterize their behavior. Rotating members of the group played the role of Lane Chu, a powerful OC who spoke to Chris, that Chris believed was actually a character from his Sonichu universe. MKR herself also pretended to be a goddess like Chris. The group used Chris's delusions to attempt to gain control of him, to convince him to drop his delusions. This plan ended up accomplishing nothing, although the concept would be executed much better several years later by an internet user named Kawaii Sandbag. Kawaii Sandbag pretended to be a psychic, and told Chris he had to give up his delusions of literally being possessed by Sonichu in order to find a girlfriend. This caused Chris to give up his delusion of literally being possessed by Sonichu. The Watchmen were able to steer Chris away from the influence of Jacob Sockness. However, they had much less luck with other trolls, like Noah, the Praetors, and their own member, Wildcat. The Praetors were a competing group of Chris enablers who were attempting to monetize Chris and who eventually won out in the end, with Chris still doing business with them to this day. Noah was a troll Chris knew in person, and who got him to come on a fake livestream talk show. And Wildcat is going to get his own section next on the Iceberg. The Watchmen split apart after MKR and Not got in an argument with Wildcat, and Chris took Wildcat's side, dropping his friendship with the other Watchmen in an instant, calling them toxic. While this is arguably true given what we know that they were trying to manipulate Chris, from his perspective, he kicked these people who were his genuine friends for several years out of his life because Wildcat told him to. The Knights of Quick, Wildcat, and Bella. The Knights of Quick were the successor to the Watchmen. After Wildcat got Chris to kick the other Watchmen out of his life, he formed a new group, consisting of himself as the leader, several stooges, and Bella, the infamous leaker of the incest call. Bella had independently, and under the Watchmen's noses, befriended Chris, and gotten him to buy her expensive gifts. Her group of friends, who had an overlap with the Knights of Quick, were a trolling group akin to the Idea Guys, who the community has dubbed the Chess Club. The Chess Club wanted to extort money out of Chris and have him continue to make a public fool of himself for fun. Wildcat was unable to control his group as cohesively as the Watchmen had, and didn't know at the time that Bella was her own mastermind of sorts of her own offshoot group of trolls. Of all the leaders of Chris groups over the years, from the Guard Dogs to the Idea Guys to the Watchmen to Bella to Praetor, Wildcat was the least competent, and he immediately lost control of the situation, drawing attention to himself on Kiwi farms. In an extremely telling instance, he reached out to me to call himself Chris's number 2 guy, and basically declare himself in charge of Chris, a kind of arrogance that few others have ever shown. Chris had been speaking to Null for a while, telling him that he was in a relationship, hinting in a roundabout way that it was Barb. But he didn't admit this to anyone until a call with Bella, in which he bragged about his relationship with his mother. Bella leaked this call to her friends, and one of those friends leaked it to the wider internet. After he was given his no-contact order, Chris was forced to live in his van, and eventually got a hotel room, all the while staying in contact with Wildcat, who continued to complain to me about his struggles. Chris seemingly didn't listen to Wildcat the way he had listened to Null or Not or the Idea Guys, and Wildcat was basically left as just some guy texting Chris, when everyone else had already given up on him. Wildcat is left as a reminder that even if you put yourself on the line and sacrifice everything you have to gain favor or control over Chris, he'll still do whatever he wants. Wildcat was able to convince Chris to drop Not an MKR, but then Chris dropped him when he was no longer needed. Bella, on the other hand, who Chris had at one point considered as a potential future sexual companion, and who he trusted more than anyone else, including Null, to tell about his affair with Barb to, became another Judas figure in Chris's eyes, calling her a hater and a betrayer, and blaming her for everything. Despite the obvious evidence to the contrary, Chris still to this day calls her a liar and blames her for his imprisonment, and denies that anything happened between him and Barb, casting his friend aside once more, once the consequences of his actions caught up to him. Once again, we as the outside public know that Bella is a terrible person, but Bella didn't leak the audio to the wider internet. She didn't betray Chris, and he knows that she didn't manipulate their phone call. He's only blaming her because it's an easy excuse to cast blame off of himself. He's throwing his friend under the bus so that he can pretend he didn't have sex with his own mother. Helena. Helena is the rare example of someone who is able to rise above her association with Chris-chan while still firmly and proudly standing by her stamp on the history of Sonichu. Helena is an artist who gained Chris's favor and made plenty of fan art of Sonichu characters, including her own OC, Pikachu. Chris considers much of her artwork to be canon to Sonichu, including the relationship between Magi-chan and Pikachu. Her Pikachu comics are very different from Sonichu's main continuity, and have a following of their own. She's also made a visual novel-style video game, including various contemporary Christorians, myself included, that unfortunately launched right before the time of Chris's arrest. Helena intends to create an ongoing fan continuation of the Sonichu comics. These plans upset Chris, although there was little input he could have while he was in jail. He continued to consider her a true friend while in jail. She was able to send him some letters, but due to his intense hold over his true and honest Sonichu canon, Chris has, on several occasions, grown angry over fanfiction that deviates too far from his own vision, which is mildly hypocritical given that Sonichu itself is a fanfiction, so he had some issues with Helena's continuation of Sonichu. He reached out to Helena after being released from jail, but before returning to the wider internet, but their relationship has not returned to how it was before his arrest. The biggest issue Helena faced came from other members of the Chris community. The Watchmen disliked her influence over Chris and the fact that she played into his delusions, despite the fact that they also played into his delusions. Helena was often targeted by the Watchmen, despite being attacked by people who hate Chris because she's friends with him, people who like Chris because they believed she had too much control over him, and people who want to control Chris because she seemingly can't be stopped. Helena has been able to shake off most attacks levied against her and live a relatively normal life. Helena has had good relationships with most Christorians and seemingly doesn't care about the negative aspects of being part of Chris's story. Despite not facing many consequences, her relationship with Chris is still incredibly toxic. Chris uses what I refer to his infinity +1 deflection against her art. Basically, because Chris believes that all pieces of fiction are real in his universe, and thus all ideas and art and stories are canon, he has been forced to accept other people's ideas of his characters as true, and thus is in a continual battle to retcon them, leading to him using the playground retort of, "Oh, your guy has infinite power? Well, mine has infinity +1. For example, when the idea guys took control of Chris's mind, they implanted multiple things into the Sonichu canon that Chris didn't approve of. Instead of later stating that these simply did not happen, he instead created a convoluted fantasy and wrote them out of the history of Sonichu with an in-universe retcon. Chris, instead of graciously taking fan art from who the Quickie describes as likely the biggest fan of Sonichu in the entire world, instead constantly struggles against Helena without showing appreciation. The jury is still out on how he will react to her future works within her Sonichu fanfiction. Jacob Sockness. Jacob Sockness literally fell in love with Chris-chan, and showed his love by buying Chris's junk from eBay. like his used shoes. Chris liked that Jacob was financially funding him, and Jacob had his own delusions about aliens and magic and other dimensions. Although arguably his are more based in actual occultism and Lovecraftian fiction, as opposed to Chris's amalgamation of random nonsense, inspired by DC Comics and My Little Pony. Jacob got his fiction and OCs to become Sonichu canon, although Chris continually had to implement his Infinity+1 defense. Jacob's lore has a dark god named Jacoba that Jacob believes is basically undefeatable. So naturally, Chris took a My Little Pony OC literally named Gary Stew and had him defeat Jacoba, so he no longer could threaten the Sonichu world. Jacob was very open about wanting to have sex with Chris, and to move into his house. He drew unwanted attention from the Watchmen, some Christorians, myself included, and the Chris community at large. At one point, he bought a train ticket to visit Chris in Virginia from California, but the Watchmen convinced Chris to make Jacob turn around, so the two have still never met in person. Chris began having doubts about Jacob when he learned more about Jacob's lore and felt it was too dark for his own universe, angry that Jacob practiced dark magic and the occult. The Watchmen and others whispering in Chris's ear, telling him to send Jacob packing, probably didn't hurt either, although he still had to reach that conclusion on his own. Once again, while we know that Jacob was an individual with bad intentions, Chris saw him as a friend, who could potentially become a lover, who gave him money, who basically worshipped the ground he walked on, and who he believed had magic powers. And Chris dropped him like a rock because his fanfiction was too dark, because he was too much of a sycophant, because for a short period of time he didn't have the funds to support Chris. Chris, post-jail, has said in a livestream that he never intends on even mentioning Jacob's name again. So while this is a good thing, it doesn't change the fact that he dropped one of his friends and potential lovers, because he wrote Sonichu fanfiction that Chris didn't like, and didn't donate more money to him. Ben Saint. Ben Saint is a fairly large YouTuber who covered Chris in the era before Geno Samuel's documentary. In 2019, he had a Discord roleplay server that included My Little Pony characters that parodied figures from Chris story. Chris was initially excited and invested in the project, but later disliked where it was going. He used his typical Infinity+1 defense, and drew his own canon Sonichu depictions of the outcome of the story that he preferred. After this, Chris approved of Ben Saint's use of some of his pony-centric characters, and even subscribed to his Patreon. So while their relationship didn't completely fall apart, it's yet another example of Chris liking someone until they don't follow the exact story that Chris wants. Kenneth. Kenneth Anglehart is the owner and operator of the Onion Farms, a competing website to the Kiwi Farms. He was a genuine fan of Sonichu. In the pre-Cell Saga era, Kenneth made Sonichu fan OCs, and financially aided Chris by donating and buying goods from him. When Chris was arrested, Kenneth was one of the few people Chris corresponded to who released their letters online, showing a rapport and friendship building between them. This started to grow sour when Kenneth explained to Chris that he planned on continuing the Sonichu comic book. He partnered with Helena and intended to grow the Sonichu base. But Chris, while in prison, hated the idea of fan comics or fan fiction, or anything of the sort being created without his ability to influence it, or, at the very least, read it to deem it canon or not. He originally sent a letter to Kenneth and Helena detailing his requirements for the project, but Kenneth and Helena decided to cut ties with Chris after it became clear that his mental state was deteriorating while in jail, and as the reality of his alleged crimes sank in. After being released from jail, Chris blocked Kenneth on Twitter, and to this day has not given his permission to make the Sonichu fan project. It's hard to label exactly what Kenneth is in the story of Chris Chan. Certainly, he was a white knight who gave money and praise to Chris, and again, was a genuine Sonichu fan. But like Sockness, he attempted to co-opt the Sonichu character and story, which angered Chris. and he did not stop when Chris expressed this anger. It seems like Kenneth is more a fan of Sonichu than he is of Chris, but Chris still was the one who soured their friendship by, once again, being overbearing about Sonichu continuity. One of the few people in the world who was a genuine fan of his work and was willing to financially back Chris and speak to him even after his arrest, Kenneth was treated with the same level of disrespect we would come to expect of anyone who questions Chris's beliefs. The Otaku King. The Otaku King is a small YouTuber who makes content about anime, who ran into Chris by random chance at Walmart. He is a genuinely nice individual who saw people bullying Chris online and wanted to help. Not financially, but by giving Chris advice and being a role model. This soon turned into him decrying trolls and defending his actions, and making the situation more about stopping bullying than guiding Chris's life. He donated money to Chris on live streams, inviting him to hang out on a day that it was going to snow, but Chris seemingly never took Otaku King up on these offers, and has never himself mentioned Otaku King as a friend. After several months of receiving warnings from the community that Chris cannot be helped, including the video that contained the comment that inspired this very video, Otaku King eventually realized the extent of Chris's delusions, seeing how ready Chris was to hurt people who stood in his way. While Chris does have a history of violent assault and wishing death on people, many think that it's more indicative of his character that his honest philosophy and religious beliefs include painful deaths for those who don't believe in his divinity, as well as those who cancel the TV shows he likes. That kind of attitude was not something the Otaku King could defend. While I doubt that Chris ever considered Otaku King to be a real friend, the fact is that Chris's delusions and egotism prevented a good-hearted individual from helping him turn his life around. Joshua Martinez. Joshua Martinez is at the bottom of the iceberg because I don't see him talked about much in Christory, and because I think he's one of Chris's worst actions when it comes to betraying his friends. Chris and Joshua met as children attending speech therapy, and stayed in touch over the years. After Chris gained internet infamy, Joshua started trolling Chris, pretending to be various women who wanted to hook up with Chris. Joshua created the character Lori, who flirted with Chris, and then told Chris that she actually preferred Josh. Basically, Josh was a troll. But Chris didn't know this. All he saw was his friend stealing all the women from him. In an effort to get the trolls from Encyclopedia Dramatica to stop trolling him, Chris wrote an angry message to his haters. "Look, pal, if you really want to take down someone who has a reputation, consider one Joshua Martinez. Ladies come a-runnin' from at least as far as New York City to his house in Dyke, Virginia. Not just any ladies, but stars like Megan Fox, Jessica Alba, Jessica Biel, Jessica Simpson, and plenty other whores. He also has been piggybacking on the stardom of Vanessa Hudgens, singing with her in her Latino albums, and starring with her in various HBO movies, and, even worse, Transformers 2. He has her and some other gal named Brittany for both his simultaneous girlfriends. Dual marriage in the works here. He is a more lucky SOB than I can ever surmount to. Ruin his reputation. Joshua Martinez. P.S. You did not hear this whole thing from me." So even though we know that Josh was trolling Chris, to Chris, Josh was one of his oldest friends. A friend who just so happened to be good-looking and have a girlfriend. Chris was like a lover scorned. A woman he was interested in picked Josh instead, and his reaction was to sick the trolls on him. He gave them Joshua's full name, and where he lived, and then tried to cover up his own involvement. Had his plan succeeded, and had his delusions been accurate, he would have been free from the trolls at the expense of one of his very few friends in the world. He would have inflicted this torment on to one of his closest friends. You know the phrase, "I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy"? Chris was suffering from the worst thing he had ever experienced, and his first thought was, you know what I should do? I should inflict this on my oldest friend. This video was created to show how Chris Chan treats his friends and people who try to help him. He is loyal to no one. He can throw years of friendships away for almost no reason. He seemingly can't be guided on how to improve his life, but can be manipulated by trolls with little effort. The Otaku King recently put out a video about how he was done trying to be Chris's big brother, which I think is good, and as this video should explain, such a thing would never end well. As of this moment, Chris's only friend is Caden, the leader of the Praetors, who we suspect set him up in his current home, is dealing with his finances, selling his art on Etsy, setting up his streams, and basically handling his brand. Caden is Chris's friend and basically manager. For the first time, someone is actually helping Chris and succeeding. The issue is that it comes at a time when people don't want Chris to succeed. 5 years ago, if Chris was given a nice home and was set up to color pictures and live stream multiple times a week, the internet would be ecstatic. He would be safe and able to pump out content, and the lols would be milked forever. But after his arrest, most people don't want to see Chris succeed. It's sad that he makes hundreds of dollars every live stream, and that people pay for his art and his products on Etsy. I think it's possible that in a few years, the Chris Chan content empire that trolls like Ivy would have loved to have created back in 2009 might actually come to be, but it'll feature a Chris Chan who has admitted to committing a very heinous crime, and who is so lost in delusions about being Jesus that there's no way he'll grow up to be a functioning individual. He'll be a lolcow forever. That is, unless his friendship with Caden falls apart, as all of his past relationships have. We'll have to wait and see. Thank you for watching. Please be nice to each other in the comments, consider supporting the creators you admire, and never lose sight of the things that are important to you. Do not contact anyone named in this video, and if you were named in this video and think that I mischaracterized your relationship with Chris Chan, you can reach out to me on Twitter at @GIBI_Devin. Please subscribe to Lore Cattle Ranch for the ongoing tragedy of Chris Chan.